Imagine the scene. A colonial village square surrounded by simple houses, the church in the background, and right in the center, a dark wooden post stained by time and blood. This was the stage where suffering stopped being private and turned into a public spectacle. It was not just the pain of one individual, but the calculated performance of a system that needed to reaffirm itself every single day in front of anyone who dared to question it. There, in the open space, the plantation owner, the overseer, the townspeople, and even children gathered to witness the humiliation of enslaved men, women, and even teenagers. In the slave quarters, the atmosphere was tense and silent. Everyone knew when the overseer approached, his harsh voice announcing that punishment was coming. It was not only the body of one enslaved person that would suffer. The entire community was struck psychologically. The slave quarters trembled not yet from the sound of the whip, but from the anticipation of what was to come. The enslaved themselves were forced to form an involuntary audience, watching one of their own being taken as an example. The purpose was clear: spread fear so that everyone would obey. Public punishments carried the meaning of a lesson, as if each lash was a class on who commanded and who had to submit. The plantation owner appeared with an air of authority, often accompanied by guests on the big house veranda. The overseer took on the role of executioner, carrying the whip, the chains, or the branding iron, always ready to turn discipline into spectacle. There was no escape. Every gaze was forced to witness the theater of pain. The square, the post, and even the slave quarters were more than just physical settings. They were symbols of power. Each space carried deep meanings. The illuminated big house represented dominance, the dark slave quarters submission, and the public square, the place where domination was displayed as ritual. Enslaved children learned from an early age with frightened eyes that life under the whip was filled with pain and humiliation. Women wept in silence, knowing that at any moment they could be the next victims of this cruel exhibition. It was common for the overseer to make sure the entire community was called to watch. The logic was perverse. The more eyes, the greater the humiliation. Punishment ceased to be merely physical and became social, corroding the dignity of the one tied to the post and of those forced to witness. Public violence created a cycle of fear that kept the slave system functioning. It was not just a punishment, it was a macabre show to maintain order. The squares became arenas of pain, where resistance was crushed in front of everyone. Each lash struck not only the skin, but also the identity, culture, and spirituality of a people ripped from their roots and thrown into chains. At the same time, masters and overseers fed their vanity, displaying power before the white community as if they were judges of an unquestionable social order. Punishments were therefore both a tool of discipline and a show of domination. In the slave quarters, after the punishment, silence was profound. The scarred body served as a living reminder. But there was something even more cruel: the marked mind. Many carried the trauma of seeing their fathers, mothers, children, or friends exposed in public squares. This wound never healed. Each memory of the spectacle became part of a collection of pains that together built a heritage of suffering and resistance. However, as much as the system wanted to turn pain into spectacle as a means of control, it also sowed the seeds of rebellion. With every public punishment in some, the flame of resistance was born. The eyes that cried in silence also learned to plan escapes, to seek refuge in quilombos, or to nurture in their hearts the hope of better days. The stage of pain also paradoxically became the cradle of the memory of freedom. But there was something the masters knew very well. Not all instruments of power were in the lashes or in the chains. There was one object in particular that carried such strong symbolism, it became the overseer's true emblem. It did not only wound flesh, but branded the soul of anyone who saw or felt it. And it is precisely about this object, the whip, the most feared weapon of slavery, that we will speak in the next chapter. Get ready. because what you are about to discover goes far beyond physical pain. The whip became a language of power, fear, and domination. If there was one object capable of summarizing the brutality of slavery, that object was the whip. It was not merely an instrument of physical punishment, but a true symbol of power. The moment the overseer raised it before the enslaved, he did not even need to use it for silence to fall over the quarters. The sound of leather cutting the air was enough to impose fear. The whip spoke before it touched the skin. It was the tongue of the overseer, translating the master's orders into pain. The lashings were so common they became part of the routine. A single glance considered disrespectful, a task done too slowly, a failed escape, or even a simple yawn at the wrong time could deliver an enslaved body to the whip. There were no clear rules. Arbitrariness was the law, and the more unpredictable the punishment, the greater the terror. Everyone in the quarters knew no one was safe. Each blow left deep marks. It was not only skin that split open, it was dignity that was torn apart. The scars were not just physical, but memories etched into the body, like involuntary tattoos of pain. There were enslaved people who carried more than 100 scars on their backs, true maps of suffering that revealed a lifetime marked by the whip. These marks were displayed in silence, turning every enslaved person into a living testimony of violence. The whip also carried symbolic value for the plantation masters. In the big house, it was seen as an extension of authority. It was common for the overseer, while walking through the sugarcane or coffee fields, to carry the whip coiled in his hand or slung over his shoulder, as a constant reminder that violence was always lurking. It was not only meant to be used, it was meant to be seen. It functioned as a permanent warning, a sign that pain could be summoned at any moment. The sound of the whip slicing the air was so feared, it became part of the collective memory of the enslaved. Some fainted just from hearing its crack. Enslaved children grew up associating that sound with terror. Enslaved women saw their children crying in despair even before the lash struck the body. The whip thus went beyond the physical. It became a sonic ghost that haunted even their dreams. In many cases, the punishment with the whip was carried out in public. The overseer made a point of delivering dozens of lashes before the gathered slave quarters. The count of blows was announced aloud, as if each number was a reminder of domination: 10, 20, 50, 100. The body bled, but the show only ended when the master decided. Often, the goal was not only to punish, but to humiliate, to show everyone that the life of an enslaved person was always hanging by a thread, always at the mercy of the leather cutting into flesh. The variations of the whip also revealed the cruelty of the system. There were rawhide whips, heavy and tearing the skin deeply. Others had metal or bone tips, multiplying the violence of each strike. Some were called cat-o'-nine tails, with multiple strands that struck different parts of the body at once. Each version of the whip carried a different way of inflicting pain, and each was used according to the crime the master believed the enslaved person had committed. But there was something even more perverse. In many cases, enslaved people themselves were forced to whip their companions under threat of also being punished. This practice destroyed bonds of solidarity and planted seeds of fear and guilt. Slavery was not content with using the whip as a weapon. It turned it into an instrument of division, forcing victims to become executioners. Perhaps this was the deepest violence of all, turning the oppressed into enforcers of oppression. Yet the whip, with all its power of imposition, also carried a paradox. Each scar left on the body of an enslaved person became a living testimony of the system's cruelty, and these testimonies were not forgotten. They turned into collective memory, into heritage passed down from generation to generation. Each mark on the body testified that slavery was not only forced labor, but also a spectacle of pain. And it is precisely at this point that a disturbing question arises. Was the whip the worst punishment? Many believed so, until they encountered another instrument, equally feared, which not only inflicted physical pain, but carried public humiliation at its core. In the next chapter, we will enter the world of the Tronco, the wooden prison that not only immobilized bodies, but displayed pain as if it were a showcase. Prepare yourself, because the cruelty you are about to learn may be even harder to imagine. If the whip represented pain in motion, the tronco symbolized immobility, helplessness, and maximum exposure. It was a simple instrument made of thick wood, but filled with cruel meanings. In it, the arms and legs of the enslaved were locked into narrow openings, forcing the body to remain bent, motionless, and vulnerable. The tronco did not only punish physically, it turned the person into a spectacle, into an object, into a showcase of humiliation. The use of the tronco was frequent in slave quarters and public squares. Once locked in, the enslaved person remained in an uncomfortable position for hours, sometimes days, under scorching sun or heavy rain. Discomfort became torment, and forced immobility was used to break not only the body's resistance, but, above all, the spirit. Whoever passed through the square saw the prisoner exposed, like a warning printed for all. This is what happens to those who dare to defy the system. The scene was devastating. Enslaved women were locked in the tronco and exposed before the community, often half-naked, targets of scornful stares and symbolic violence. Children witnessed their parents suffering, engraving in their memories images of pain that would never fade. The tronco was more than wood. It was a stage of psychological torture where dignity was shattered under the gaze of all. The overseer made sure to drag the enslaved to the tronco before the entire slave quarters. The ritual was always accompanied by harsh words, insults, and the laughter of those who thought themselves superior. For the plantation masters, the tronco was a pedagogical tool. It showed clearly and publicly what disobedience meant. For the enslaved, it was a living nightmare, where the body became a message of fear for the whole community. Many who endured the tronco described that the pain did not only come from the forced position, but from exposure. Humiliation corroded more than the body. Some preferred lashes over being locked there before everyone, reduced to an object of mockery. Some, after days in the tronco, were left with permanent physical injuries, unable to walk or work normally. Others carried invisible scars, memories of shame imposed before eyes that could do nothing but watch. And the spectacle did not end with the punishment itself. Many times the masters allowed passers-by to mock the enslaved person in the tronco. White children threw stones, adults spat, laughed and pointed, turning pain into public entertainment. The tronco therefore did not only punish, it involved the entire community in the act of humiliation, making even the bystanders accomplices. Suffering stopped being individual and became a collective scene of degradation. Yet the tronco also became a place of silent resistance. Some enslaved people, even locked inside, kept their eyes firm, refusing to cry before the audience. This defiant posture unsettled overseers and masters who intensified punishments to try to crush any sign of dignity. But each resistant gaze left its mark. It was as if it said, "You can lock my body, but you will not dominate my soul." The memory of the tronco crossed centuries. In the accounts of foreign travelers who witnessed colonial practices, shock was evident. Many described the tronco as proof of the brutality of slavery, something that revealed the true face of the system. For the descendants of enslaved people, the tronco became a symbol of collective suffering, but also of memory. It was the reminder of a past that could not be forgotten, for it carried the living proof that pain had been turned into spectacle. And there was yet another layer of cruelty. The tronco was often used in combination with other instruments of pain. The enslaved person locked inside could also be whipped, branded with hot iron, or forced to endure heavy chains. The body, already vulnerable, became the target of multiple violences, prolonging the torment to the maximum. It was as if the tronco were only the stage, and the other instruments the actors of a macabre performance. But as terrible as the tronco was, there were punishments that went even further than exposure and humiliation. Punishments involving fire, iron, and objects created specifically to inflict extreme and permanent pain. Instruments that not only punished but left scars impossible to hide, turning each body into a living document of violence. In the next chapter, we will go even deeper into this dark universe. The punishments of iron and fire, created to brand, mutilate, and silence the enslaved. Prepare yourself, because what comes next is one of the most cruel and disturbing faces of slavery. If the tronco exposed the body to public scorn, the punishments of iron and fire took pain to an even more cruel and permanent level. They did not merely punish in the moment, they marked forever, turning the skin of the enslaved into a living scar, into an eternal reminder of ownership. Red-hot irons, heavy chains, iron collars, and hooks were used not only to inflict physical pain, but to transform the body itself into a symbol of submission. The branding iron was perhaps the most feared. Heated until it glowed, it was pressed against the skin of the enslaved to inscribe marks that identified to whom they belonged. As if they were cattle, men and women were burned with symbols, letters, or the initials of plantation masters. The smell of burning flesh spread through the air, shocking everyone around. The pain was unbearable, but the worst came after. The scar never disappeared. It was a constant reminder that freedom had been stolen and replaced by a mark of possession. Beyond branding, there were the chains. Heavy, cold, always too tight, they bound feet, hands, and necks, making every movement painful. Some enslaved people were forced to work chained for days, dragging the iron links while cutting cane or carrying loads. The metallic sound of chains became part of the soundtrack of the slave quarters, a constant reminder of slavery. To sleep, many could not even lie down fully, as the links cut into their skin and caused wounds that became infected. Another terrifying instrument was the iron collar, a kind of heavy neck piece with hooks or sharp points that dug into the neck and shoulders. Some of these collars had bells or metal pieces that rattled with each step, revealing the presence of any enslaved person trying to escape. It was not just pain, it was constant surveillance. The collar turned the body into a walking prison, preventing free movement and reminding at all times that any attempt at freedom would be punished with suffering. And there were the iron hooks used to fasten enslaved people to walls or wooden structures, forcing them to remain standing without rest for endless hours. Many fainted from exhaustion, only to be awakened by lashings and put back into the same position. This type of punishment required no words. The body spoke for itself, turned into an object of torture and spectacle. Perhaps one of the most perverse torments was the so-called night torture. And in this punishment, the enslaved was bound with chains, collars, or hooks, and left alone in the darkness, with open wounds without water or food. The night became the enemy. Every sound, every gust of wind, every shadow heightened the psychological terror. Many screamed until they lost their voices, while the slave quarters, powerless, heard from afar the echoes of pain. The night torture did not only punish the body, but corroded the mind, leaving traumas that haunted forever. The purpose of these instruments was not only to punish, they were meant to dehumanize. By branding the body with iron, chaining it or restricting it with collars, the system declared, "You are not a person, you are property." It was an attempt to erase identities, cultures, and dreams. But paradoxically, each mark also became a living testimony of the violence suffered, passed down to future generations as memory of resistance. Many foreign travelers who visited colonial Brazil reported these punishments of iron and fire with horror. Their descriptions, recorded in diaries and letters, reveal the shock at such cruelty. They could not comprehend how a society could coexist with so much exposed pain, while at the same time celebrating parties, masses, and social gatherings as if nothing were happening. This contradiction exposed the hypocrisy of a system sustained by blood and suffering. But the spectacle did not end with the glowing iron or the chains. The masters knew how to turn these punishments into true public rituals, in which pain was displayed as a demonstration of power. It was not enough to wound, it had to be shown. And thus, the suffering of the enslaved was turned into entertainment for the elite, as if it were a macabre theater where each moan was an applause reinforcing the order. And it is precisely this disturbing aspect that we will address in the next chapter, how punishments stopped being mere penalties and began to be staged as spectacles before all. Prepare yourself, because what you will see is the transformation of pain into a true theater of domination. Slavery was not content with simply punishing, it turned pain into a public ritual. What could have been a punishment limited to the slave quarters or applied in silence away from the eyes of the community became a real spectacle. Plantation masters understood that the suffering of a single body could serve as a collective lesson, and for that reason they insisted on staging each punishment as if it were a macabre ceremony. The squares filled with people. Men, women, and even white children gathered to watch the spectacle of pain. It was not rare for guests to be invited to the big house precisely on days of punishment, as if that moment were part of social entertainment. The enslaved person, chained, became the involuntary actor of a play whose script was already written. He was guilty, and the audience awaited the scene of his degradation. The overseer, often dressed in imposing fashion, assumed the role of master of ceremonies. He raised the whip, announced the number of lashes, counted aloud. With each strike, the body convulsed and the audience reacted with varied expressions. Some laughed, others applauded, others simply watched in silence, as if pain were a natural part of life. This theater of violence reinforced not only the hierarchy between masters and enslaved, but also created a macabre normality in which cruelty was trivialized. The spectacle of punishment also carried a devastating psychological component. The enslaved who were not being punished were forced to watch. Their tears, their desperate gazes, their helplessness became part of the show. The lesson was not only for the one being whipped, but for all. See what happens when someone dares to disobey. Thus, each blow struck not only the victim, but hundreds of hearts that learned to obey through fear. In some cases, public punishments were announced in advance, almost like events. The bell might ring, the community was summoned, and everyone knew there would be pain to watch. White women brought their children, teaching from an early age that the social order was upheld by violence. Children grew up normalizing other people's suffering, learning that the humiliation of one people was the spectacle of another. In this way, slavery perpetuated not only wounded bodies, but minds shaped by cruelty. It was common that, after the punishment, there were parties in the Casa Grande. While a body was still bleeding in the tronco, the masters toasted with wine, celebrating business and alliances. Pain was so trivialized that it fit naturally into the elite's routine. The suffering of the enslaved was reduced to a side act, an intermission in the social calendar. That indifference was perhaps more cruel than the whip itself, because it showed that the victim's humanity wasn't worth even a sigh. Foreign travelers who witnessed these scenes recorded with astonishment the theatricality of the punishments. For them, it was not merely discipline, it was a spectacle of humiliation. Some compared the practice to the arenas of ancient Rome, where gladiators were displayed to entertain through their pain. The difference was that here there was no glory, only degradation. The colonial square was a smaller arena, but just as cruel, where the audience fed on human suffering. But this spectacle had profound consequences. By exposing pain so openly, the system believed it was reinforcing its strength, but it was also planting seeds of revolt. Many enslaved people who watched these rituals carried within themselves hatred and the desire to escape. For some, each blow witnessed was a reminder that life would only make sense if it were lived in freedom. Quilombos were born from this silent revolt, fueled by every tear and every moan heard in the squares. The spectacle of punishment was not forgotten. It was etched into collective memory, a historical scar that crossed generations. Even today, when we speak of structural racism, social inequality, and exclusion, we are dealing with the shadows of those public rituals of pain. The black body remains exposed, often criminalized and humiliated before society. The legacy of this cruel theater still echoes in alleyways, in favelas, and in the gazes that carry the mark of centuries of oppression. Yet if punishments were already cruel as spectacle, there were moments when violence went further, turning punishment into execution. Pain did not stop at the lash or the chain. In many cases, the outcome was death itself, displayed before everyone as an act of example and intimidation. And that is precisely what we will reveal in the next chapter, when public punishment ceased to be merely a penalty and became a death sentence. Prepare yourself, because what comes next is one of the darkest and most disturbing pages in the history of slavery. There were moments when pain crossed every boundary. The whip, the tronco, and the red-hot iron were already cruel. But on certain occasions, the punishment did not end in public humiliation. It advanced to the extreme, death itself. For plantation masters, taking the life of an enslaved person was not only a punishment, but a demonstration of absolute power. The execution became a spectacle meant to petrify fear in the hearts of all who watched. The Pelourinho, raised in the centers of colonial towns, was the highest symbol of this macabre logic. There, before the church, the square, and the Casa Grande, bodies were exposed, whipped, and in many cases executed. The Pelourinho was not just wood, it was a monument of domination, a permanent reminder that the social order was upheld by blood. Anyone who passed by it knew that lives had been destroyed in that space as an example to maintain discipline. Among the most brutal punishments were public hangings. The enslaved person accused of escape, insubordination, or even theft was taken to the square and hanged before the crowd. Children, women, masters, and overseers watched in silence as the body slowly swayed in the air. The goal was not only to kill, but to display death, to prolong the visual suffering so that everyone would etch the scene into memory. There were also cases of dismemberment. Enslaved people accused of leading rebellions were killed and their bodies divided into parts, scattered along roads and plantations as a warning. Arms, legs, and heads were nailed to posts as if they were signboards. Do not defy the order. This cruel practice not only destroyed lives, but tried to crush any hope of collective resistance. Executions, however, were not always swift. Many times, they were preceded by prolonged torture. The torment became a sequence of acts. First the lash, then the tronco, then branding with hot iron until finally death. It was as if the masters wanted to savor every moment of pain before carrying out the final act. For them, the longer the punishment, the greater the lesson delivered to the community. The psychological impact of these deaths was devastating. Every enslaved person who witnessed an execution knew they could be next. The silence after death was heavy. The senzala sank into forced mourning, without the right to public tears, without a proper wake, without farewell. The body of the enslaved did not belong even to themselves or their family. It was property until the last breath. And often, death was followed by prohibition, no prayers, no honorable burial. The violence continued even beyond. The masters believed these deaths would crush any seed of revolt. But instead, each execution also became collective memory. The name of the enslaved person killed was whispered in the senzala at night, remembered as a martyr, as someone who dared to resist and paid the highest price. Thus, the attempt to silence often turned into fuel to keep the flame of freedom alive. Foreigners who witnessed these events described the brutality with horror. Accounts by English and French travelers point out that they had never seen such a normalization of violence. While in Europe, public executions were rare and surrounded by formality, in colonial Brazil, the death of an enslaved person became routine, a banalized spectacle that coexisted with parties and religious ceremonies. The hypocrisy was evident. People prayed in church for the salvation of the soul while celebrating the execution of the black body. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect was this: the life of an enslaved person was worth less than a broken tool. Many masters preferred to kill as an example rather than lose authority before the community. The logic was clear and cruel. Power was sustained not only by wealth, but by fear. And there was no greater fear than watching someone die before your eyes. But as much as executions sought to bury hope, the truth is that death never managed to silence resistance completely. Each life taken became a whispered story, a transmitted memory, a reminder that the struggle was not over. And it was precisely this silent resistance that gave rise to spaces of freedom, places where pain was not spectacle, but where hope was reborn in the form of community. And it is about this courageous response, born amid blood and chains, that we will speak in the next chapter, the Quilombos. They emerged as cries of resistance against the spectacle of death and became symbols of freedom that echo to this day. If public punishment sought to turn pain into spectacle and death into example, there was a silent response growing in the shadows: escape. Each lash, each body marked at the tronco, each execution before the community did not only extinguish lives, but also lit a flame inside those who still stood. That flame was called resistance. And the greatest symbol of that resistance was the Quilombo. Escape was not simple. Chains, iron collars, armed overseers, and hunting dogs were always ready to track down any attempt at freedom. Yet still, thousands of enslaved people risked everything. On dark nights, some disappeared into the forest, guided only by the moon and by hope. They knew that if caught, the punishment would be brutal: the tronco, the whip, the branding iron, or even death. Even so, they chose to face the unknown in search of something greater than survival itself: the dignity of living in freedom. The Quilombos began as refugees, but soon turned into organized communities. They were more than hideouts. They were territories of resistance, where African culture flourished, where black bodies were not property, but free people. In the heart of the forests, far from the Casa Grande and the Senzala, men and women rebuilt families, built houses, planted crops, and created defense systems. Each Quilombo was a silent yet powerful declaration: we do not accept the spectacle of pain. The most famous of all, the Quilombo of Palmares, became legend. Located in the Serra da Barriga in Alagoas, it came to shelter thousands of people. It was a true free territory, defying the logic of slavery. Palmares not only resisted constant attacks from colonial troops, but showed that it was possible to live outside the system, that freedom was not just a dream, but a concrete reality. Zumbi dos Palmares, its most well-known leader, became a symbol of courage and resistance, inspiring future generations. But Palmares was not the only one. Smaller quilombos spread throughout Brazil, in Minas Gerais, Bahia, Maranhão, São Paulo. In every region where there was slavery, there was also escape and resistance. Each quilombo, large or small, was an open wound in the slave system, living proof that not everybody could be dominated by the whip, the Tronco, or the Pelourinho. The Quilombos were also spaces of culture. There, African languages, music, dances, religions and rituals that the system tried to erase were preserved. In the Senzalas, culture was repressed. In the Quilombos, it thrived. It was the memory of ancestors being passed on, the bond with Africa being maintained even thousands of miles away. Resistance was not only physical, but also spiritual and cultural. And each Quilombo was a cry against the spectacle of pain. While in the squares suffering was staged to maintain fear, in the forests freedom was lived as victory. The plantation masters knew this, and that is why they dedicated enormous resources to destroy these territories. Military expeditions were constantly sent to hunt down Quilombolas, but even in the face of brutal attacks, many Quilombos resisted for decades, some even for centuries. The slave system wanted public punishments to extinguish hope, but the Quilombos proved the exact opposite. The more cruel the punishment, the stronger the desire to resist. For every life taken at the Pelourinho, other lives were reborn in the forests, rebuilding homes, families, and free communities. The spectacle of pain thus became fuel for the spectacle of resistance. But the question that still echoes today is, did slavery really end when the chains were broken, or did public punishments only change form, continuing to exist in new social structures, in new ways of exposing pain and humiliation in public? And it is precisely this reflection that will lead us to the final chapter, how the memory of those punishments still echoes in the present, transformed into invisible chains that mark society to this day. Prepare yourself, because the conclusion will show that the history of pain did not remain in the past. It is still alive in our present. Throughout this journey, we have seen how public punishments turn pain into spectacle, how the whip, the tronco, the branding iron and even death were used to impose fear and sustain a system built on violence. But arriving here, an inevitable question arises. Did this story remain only in the past? Or do we, in some way, still carry the marks of those rituals of pain in the present? The chains that bound feet and hands were broken, but new chains, invisible ones, still restrict lives. Structural racism, social inequality, favelas built on neglect, the criminalization of poverty. All of this is a direct inheritance of the spectacle of suffering once staged in colonial squares. Today, bodies are no longer exposed in Pelourinhos, but they are still judged, surveilled, and humiliated in public spaces in other ways. The Senzala left marks that remain in the alleyways of the outskirts, in unequal working conditions, in the lack of opportunities. The Tronco is no longer in the squares, but humiliation still exists in scornful looks, in closed doors, in walls that separate those who can live with dignity from those who struggle daily to survive. The whip no longer cuts flesh, but its marks still appear in statistics of violence, hunger, and exclusion. Yet just as Quilombos once arose as a response to cruelty, today there are also spaces of resistance and rebuilding. They are communities, movements and voices rising against invisible chains, demanding respect, equality, and memory. Each act of denunciation, each inclusion project, each fight for social justice is a new Quilombo rising against oblivion. The memory of public punishments cannot be erased. It must be remembered not as a spectacle of pain, but as testimony to the courage and resistance of a people who, even in the face of extreme cruelty, never stopped fighting. To remember is an act of resistance. To tell these stories is to prevent silence from erasing scars that shape the society we live in. And this is where you, who made it to the end of this video, become part of this story. By knowing the past, you become responsible for reflecting on the present and acting to transform the future. Because the spectacle of pain must never be repeated, neither on the stages of colonial squares nor in the inequalities that still wound so many today. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and share this video. Help spread the memory so that more people may know the truth about public punishments and understand that the struggle for freedom and dignity continues.